Hello and welcome everyone to this McGraw-Hill Education webinar, Igniting Learning Through Inquiry. I'm Jenna Parthamore with McGraw-Hill Education and I will be the webinar moderator for today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping items. This webinar is being presented in listen-only mode, which means you will be able to hear our presenter, but they won't be able to hear you. However, that doesn't mean you cannot participate. We of course want to hear any questions you have, so type those into the Q&A panel on your toolbar. Joining us today is Dr. Marcia Royt. Dr. Royt is one of the authors of the SRA Open Court Reading Program and the past Director of Professional Development for SRA McGraw-Hill. She has spent a significant amount of time in classrooms developing reading and writing curricula, as well as working with teachers and administrators in the implementation of instructional practices. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Marcia. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Jenna, and good afternoon to everyone out there whom I can't see. Looking forward, though, to a productive afternoon and sharing about inquiry. And some of you may be familiar with inquiry, but today I think we're going to take a look at it and compare it to what we traditionally think is inquiry, what we need to be doing to move our students along into greater learning, and also what we as teachers can do to support that. The purpose of education is clearly to encourage and support learning. And while we all tend to work on those skills and strategies related to reading and writing, there's so much more to education. Education should be an enlightening proposition. Our students should be engaged in learning and learning to enjoy learning as part of their life's pursuit. So let's take a look at inquiry and how it will actually help us ignite learning. What is inquiry? Inquiry can be defined very simply as a systematic investigation that addresses a problem or a question by seeking more information or knowledge. And you'll notice that two words are underlined, problem and question. Because while many of us think that we've been doing inquiry in the classroom, inquiry tends to be more like a term paper rather than the identification of a problem and using that problem as the driving force behind what we are going to be doing. The problem and the question then become the focus of the learning. And this is something that we want our students to learn to do, because in real life, that's what jobs are all about today. Identifying problems, raising questions, and coming up with solutions. And if we really are preparing our students for a successful professional life, and a successful personal life too, we want them to begin to recognize the role of learning, of identifying problems and questions, and coming up with solutions. And in fact, inquiry will help lay the foundation for that. So let's take a look. Why inquiry? Well, first and foremost, it gives purpose to the reading, writing, and learning that we talk about in the classroom every day. Suddenly, students are going to be reading in pursuit of knowledge, knowledge that will help them with the questions that they've raised, with the conjectures that they've raised, and that they're going to be sharing with others. Writing suddenly now becomes a tool for communication, not just with the teacher, but with peers in the classroom. And we want our students to be sharing learning. As professionals, we do this all the time. We pick up a journal article. There's new information in there. We work on sharing learning as professionals all the time. And we need to have our students begin to do this. It's not just what goes on between the teacher and the students, but what goes on between the students and the students. Inquiry helps build a knowledge base. And it's a knowledge base about something that is of personal interest to students. It helps them expand their ideas and use that information connected to what they already know to build new knowledge. Inquiry also develops habits of mind. And what do we mean by habits of mind? Because that term does get used a lot. Well, when you start taking a look at habits of mind, You're talking about qualities like perseverance, sticking to something, about flexibility, about applying knowledge, asking questions, solving problems, and thinking and communicating clearly and precisely. This is where we want to take our students, and inquiry will lay the foundation for that. We want our students to appreciate that learning takes time and that learning takes effort. In this world that we live in today, things happen all the time in a split second, and we think we know it all. Headlines are out there. We know it all. We pick up something, we read it quickly, we share it on public media, on media throughout on the internet, and we think we know everything. In fact, learning does take time and effort and doesn't happen in split seconds. So inquiry does prepare our students for real life. And related to that habit of mind, inquiry fosters collaboration and problem solving. I love this cartoon. You have 3 mice looking how to get through the maze. They can do it themselves. They can confer. They can work collaboratively. And when they do that, they are able to see the solutions to the problem and how to solve it. Inquiry fosters collaboration and problem solving. It is students working together to solve a common problem. So let's take a look at what we conventionally have done in terms of research and inquiry, what we think is inquiry, and then what we're really talking about today, the kind of inquiry that fosters learning, develops habits of mind, and supports our students as they become engaged in the greater society and in their jobs. So conventional research in the past has, if it ever comes on, and it's not, I don't know why this isn't, has assigned topics. Sorry, folks. Assigned topics. We as teachers have tend to given topics to students to work on. I remember being in California in 4th grade, and in 4th grade, students would work on the California missions. An assigned topic, very broad, very unfocused, and that's what students expected to do, were expected to do. And they tended to use a limited number of resources. And today, by limited number of resources, we know that everyone gets on the internet, everyone looks at a couple of resources, and we think we have all the information that we possibly need. And then there is some final product that, in fact, goes to the teacher. The inquiry process, on the other hand, is based on student questions. Now, that's sometimes hard for us as teachers to give up that control and to say to students, okay, you come up with the questions. You come up with the focus of what you want to research. But in fact, in real life, that is how we deal with problems and how we come up with creative solutions. We're motivated by things that we are personally interested in. So we want students to begin to understand that and raise questions. Inquiry is driven by conjectures, that we take those questions and we use them to formulate a conjecture. And it's like a mini hypothesis, for lack of a better way of explaining it. It's what we think the answer to our question is now based upon what we already know. So if I raise a question, this is what I think the answer is going to be. It's not like a prediction where you're using information in the text or that you've read and that you're using. This is more like a mini hypothesis based upon what we think we know now the answer to the question will be. Then we're going to use multiple and varied resources. And I really want to underscore this, that we want to use not just the kinds of resources that you get on the internet, but things like surveys, collecting data, interviews with people, really beginning to develop substantive information that will help address our conjecture. And then one of the most challenging parts of inquiry, and I think it's challenging for us as well as for the students, is that you don't always come up with an answer, that this isn't about right or wrong, that in fact our conjecture may or may not be supported by the research we're doing, and that rather than saying, okay, this didn't work out, we say maybe we need to change the question. Maybe we need to reevaluate the conjecture. So findings always lead to more questions, which leads to more research. And if you think about the real world of medicine, of biology, of physics, questions lead to more questions. And that's what we're hoping to develop in our students as we talk about igniting learning through inquiry. So let's take a look at how inquiry works in the classroom. Of course, we need to begin to focus on choosing an area of interest. And if you take a look at the more conventional, and I'm not saying it's bad, I'm not being judgmental about it, we usually assign the topic, and they tend to be fairly broad areas. You know, let's take a look at the environment in our communities. Let's take a look at the ecological issues in our school community. That's very broad, and it means that students really have a hard time focusing on what they need to be looking for. In contrast, inquiry begins not with us assigning the question, but with students reading, and reading to explore ideas and begin to formulate as they read what they are interested in. They begin to develop wonderings and questions. Why is it in our schoolyard, if we're talking about ecology, we have grass growing some places but not in others? What are the ecological issues that are creating this situation in our schoolyard? We can talk about it in the broader community itself when we talk about ecology and talk about issues there that are raised all the time about recycling and why it is that recycling has become such an issue. How can we do it more efficiently? How can we recycle specifically trash? Or another area might be how we can recycle garbage rather than just throwing it into a dump. Let's begin to have our students raise questions and focus on what is of personal interest to them. And I have an example. In a third grade class, students were beginning to focus on learning about money. Now, the curriculum is telling the teacher that they have to talk about money. But the students themselves can raise many, many questions. It's not that they can read about anything and do anything that they want to. So they started reading about a variety of selections about money. And they read about barter. They read about how money is created by our government, what other governments do. And as ideas and interests began to formulate and ferment, the teacher and the students wrote them down. And I think this is so critical. Don't expect to remember them. None of us do that. But begin to post them on a theme board or an area in the class so those questions are there. Put student names on the questions. And then all of those questions can be reorganized. So you can look at common questions and begin to form groups based upon the interests of the students rather than us assigning students to groups. How do we decide on that question? Well, if we take a look at conventional research, we usually ask the questions, and they tend to be topic-driven. In contrast, the inquiry process is based on student questions, and the questions tend to be how and why questions, not when and where. Because when and where tend to be answered by looking up the information in an encyclopedia or on a website, and you come up with one or two pieces of information, and that's the answer, and that's the end of the paper. But when you focus on how and why questions, you're really looking for solutions to problems rather than factual information. And as I noted a minute ago, questions determine the makeup of the collaborative group. Collaboration is key. And in the past, we tend to drive the formation of those groups. And even within the groups, we drive who does what. In the inquiry process, if 4 students are interested in a common area related to money or barter or whatever, they form a group. And the others may form different groups, but all of this information will begin to come together and answer questions related to money. I love this cartoon. Now that you've read the story about Ellie the hippo, it's time for the questions. Okay, why is Ellie living in a cage at the zoo? Why can't she live in a big pond or even a river? Don't you think if she had more room to move around, she wouldn't be so chubby? Not your questions, Ruthie, the workbook's questions. And why do they get to ask all the questions? Beginning in pre-kindergarten, our students are loaded with questions about the world in which they live, those things that just cause them to look around and say, why, how? And by the time they get through with kindergarten, they're not asking any questions anymore because we have been doing it. We really have to provide the opportunity for all of our students to ask questions. And when we talk about money, let's think about this. This is a 3rd grade class, as I mentioned. And as they were reading about barter and money, all part of the curriculum, so this is all very neatly connected to what we expect our children to be learning, they began generating questions. Why is it important to have a system of money? How would your life change if suddenly there were no money? When people use credit cards, are they paying with real money? How are money, credit cards, and checks different, and which is better to use? How does government keep track of the money it prints? How come we can't make our own money? How does the government decide on how much money to print and when to print it? And why can't the government just print more money to get rid of poverty? You know, when you take a look at these questions, there are a couple there that you can get online. And, for example, when people use credit cards, are they paying with real money? You can find that out very easily. But take a look at the questions that some of the students were asking. How does government keep track of the money it prints? You know, they just don't have a listing of all of the dollar bills. There are multiple ways that they keep track of money, and, interestingly, for different reasons. How come we can't make our own money? Well, that can be a more straightforward answer, but it really does create problems in terms of our economy and the cost of things, and what is the basis of the cost. Now you're getting into some pretty sophisticated ideas, all from student questions. And my favorite that came out of this class is, why can't the government just print more money to get rid of poverty? Again, these are questions that are going to lead students in multiple directions to learn about our monetary system and how it works. But they're not the teacher questions, they're the student questions. So let's take those questions and think about conjectures. If you're talking about conventional research, there really are no conjectures. Research becomes a topic or a question that's usually asked by the teacher. This is in marked contrast to the inquiry process, where questions are used to formulate conjectures. Conjectures, as I noted earlier, are what we think will happen based upon what we know now. And if we take a look at those questions that the students were asking, they could come up with some conjectures. For example, it's important to have a single system of money so we can buy and sell things. So there's no confusion, basically, in the buying and selling process. What students are going to find out, too, it's not just about buying and selling, but it's about earning power as well. The government controls money by keeping a record of all the money it prints. Now, as students do their research, they are going to find that there are other ways that the government controls money other than by keeping a record. And they are going to learn how the government will take back money when it's damaged, how they print money only to replace that, and how the whole economic system is based upon the amount of money that the government prints, and that is driven by our economy, about inflation and deflation. Now, I don't expect third graders necessarily use those terms, but they are going to learn that how the money is controlled is pretty sophisticated. All countries do have some form of money, but almost all countries do, but there are still some countries that have barter, and within some countries that have a monetary system, barter is still a key form. So there's a whole way of seeing how barter and money can interact. The government prints money when they think people need it. Now remember, these are conjectures. This is what students think now. So you and I could go and say as a group, we need more money and the government will print it. Now, what students will find out, that's not going to work out. And it's directly related to the next one. If the government printed more money to help the poor, they would need to print a lot of money. Good conjecture, but that's not how students are going to find out that it works. They are going to be expanding their understanding of our whole monetary system when they realize you can't just print money when people need it, because that impacts everything that goes on in our economic system. It can lead to, as I said, inflation if there's too much money out there, or deflation, and if the money is too tight, then you have other problems. So students, even at the third grade level, can ask good questions and begin to explore ideas about money and our government's role in it. Identifying needs. In most cases, in conventional research, students will use books, magazines, and of course, we shouldn't forget the Internet. I mean, that is the primary source of most information, that and social media. And what this is going to provide us an opportunity to do, and I think a critical opportunity, is to begin to say to students, how do you know this is a valid resource? They need to begin to question information. Just because it's in a book, just because it's on the Internet, doesn't mean it's always true. In the inquiry process, students are going to be using a wide range of resources. Yes, they're going to be using books and magazines and the newspaper and the Internet, but we want them to go beyond that. We want them to do things like interviews. We want them to talk to people who know about money in this case. Maybe the local bank president, maybe several bank presidents. We may want to have them take surveys of people in the community and their ideas about money. In some cases, not necessarily the one we're talking about now related to money, but in some cases it may be actually data collection. If students are exploring ideas related to science where they can observe and follow through on different kinds of patterns that they see evolving. Perfect example. You can collect data on the different kinds of foods birds eat. And you could very easily begin to talk about birds who have certain characteristics eat certain kinds of foods and others eat other kinds of foods. This is the kind of data collection that we are talking about. Is it like science? You better believe it. But this is laying the foundation for understanding the whole scientific process. Another one of my favorite cartoons today. No, Jimmy, you can't cite Wikipedia as the main source for your assignment. Why? Because Wikipedia is created by people just like you and me. Yes, it is monitored, but everything on it is not true. And we have to help our students understand that what they are reading should be questioned. And using multiple resources allows you to begin to look at information and say, you know, this person says this, but 3 or 4 other people say something totally different, and it's much more consistent. Multiple resources help students learn to verify information. So, for example, let's get back to money. Money is something we all like. So once the students formulated their conjectures and, again, based groups upon those questions, they began to identify resources. One group decided they would interview local bank managers, and I thought this was interesting. They wanted to talk to more than one about how the government controls money and what would happen if the government printed more money to give to the poor. A great resource. They could go to a Treasury website. There are incredibly fine websites out there, government-sponsored, that are very supportive of good learning. And the Treasury website is a perfect one to find out how the government decides to print more money. They can talk to professors and teachers from local colleges and high schools, use newspapers, books, internet. It is unlimited. But by going to multiple examples, you begin to see different points of view, critical in research. You begin to see that you have to evaluate information and that everything out there isn't absolutely true. We need to begin to evaluate what we are reading. And that is something that is very hard for students to do. As a matter of fact, I think it's probably very hard for a lot of us to do. So inquiry begins to lay that foundation. I love this one because this is so true. Get all the information on you can, and then we'll think of a use for it later. And just think of some of your students who have been doing a research paper, and they go out and they're reading and they get all of this information, and then they don't know what to do with it. Well, part of the reason is because the topics are too broad. They don't have a focus. And Conjectures will help students focus their research, focus what they are looking for, the information that they need to get in order to support or refute that conjecture. So it's not helter-skelter. It's not random. But the research, the looking for information, becomes very focused, and the information becomes very functional. So we want to organize that information. Now that we have it, what are we going to do with it? Well, most of the time, students will review their notes, and they'll identify main ideas, and then they will write their paper based upon those main ideas. Hopefully, they have enough information. Hopefully, they don't have too much information, because then the paper just becomes a regurgitation of everything out there with no organization at all. Now, when we talk about the inquiry process, yes, we want students to review the notes, but we need to have them also evaluate their findings from surveys, interviews, and any observations that they did. What did I learn out there from talking with people, from watching, from observing, from listening to others? They need to be connected to the conjecture. Because remember, the goal isn't getting a right answer. It's finding evidence to support or refute the conjecture. And then we want to create charts and other graphics to really help organize that idea so we can share that with people. So, for example, as students were doing their research to support or refute their conjecture, they collected the information and they began to organize it around key ideas. And, one of the things we need to encourage students to do, and I don't know how many of you have done this, but I certainly have, is to create charts or use stick-ums or some way to put ideas on pieces of paper and move them around. So you have a broad area, a topic, and then you can take all the pieces of information that relate to that main idea. And then you can take the others and organize them to other ideas and then begin to draw lines to see how everything is connected. Students love doing this. But instead of us giving them a chart to organize their idea or a graphic organizer to organize their ideas, let them create their own graphic organizer in a big way, using a big board where they can put all these pieces of paper and see how to make the connections among all the different pieces of research that they did. This is so critical for them to see how the ideas begin to come together. But this also means that it's going to help them use their new knowledge to inform and update their conjecture. Did I find out the information that I wanted to find out? Did I find out different information that's going to lead me to a new conjecture? And if we go to the one that we were talking about, money, we can take a look at how these conjectures can change. I took one, and this is one that the students worked on. If the government printed more money to help the poor, they would need to print a lot of money. Perfectly good conjecture at the beginning of their research because it made sense. If the government could just print more money, we would take care of poverty. But as they did their research, now this is third grade, as they did their research, they began to realize from the information they were getting that printing money, just to print money, can have a major impact on our economy. If the government gave away a lot of money, or it would actually become worth less. The more money that is out there, the less it would buy. It would take more money to buy the same amount of groceries, gas, and clothing. And this came not just from their reading, but they talked, remember, to bank managers. So they really could get a grasp of what it means to print more money and how it would impact the economy and our buying power. So they came up with a revised conjecture. If you can't print more money, if that isn't good, then what the government needs to do is to take the money that we already have and figure out how the poor can get more of it without just printing it. And this means leading to job issues. It means talking about how we can create situations where there are more jobs out there, so the money that is out there goes to more people. Yes, it's pretty sophisticated. I absolutely agree with you. But students can do it when they are given the time to really read and research what their conjecture is, when they are interested and motivated to learn more about the questions that they have asked. And we, of course, need to share findings. And in conventional research, it's usually a paper. We give it to the teacher, and it's evaluated based on the content. And not bad. As I said, I'm not making value judgments about this. But let's take a look at the inquiry process and how it is different, which is the focus of what we're doing today. The sharing of findings can take any form at all. What we want to do is to have our students be creative in how they share information. We want it shared not just with the teacher, but with the class. Real research is shared with peers. It's shared with the greater learning community because what we learn should be shared with others who are interested in common issues, common questions, common hypotheses. And sharing it just with the teacher doesn't do that. And again, this is one of those more challenging parts of inquiry is the evaluation is based on the revision of the conjecture and the development of new questions. It isn't just based on the content of the paper that is handed in, but what have you, the student, done with the information that you were researching to impact the conjecture that you raised at the very beginning? And what new questions have come up as a result of your research? This is what inquiry is all about. It is habits of mind. It is growth of intellectual learning. It is knowledge building. So in sharing, students might want to do a number of different things. They can do PowerPoint presentations just like we're doing now, or there are all kinds of presentations out there now that are interesting and exciting that students can use. Photo essays, panel discussions, decision trees that really show where the conjecture started, what the new information was, and how it has changed the original conjecture. Poster presentations, just as we do at professional meetings. We want games, videos, and any combination of these different formats. Now, I know some of you are thinking, well, this sounds like sort of pie in the sky. How can students do this? Where do you begin it? Because, I'm teaching in kindergarten. Well, you can begin it as early as pre-K and K. This was something that a kindergarten class did when they were working on a social studies unit related to friendship. And it was during the time of Hurricane Katrina, as you can see. So what they did is they began to ask questions about what could be done to help the people who were involved with Hurricane Katrina, who didn't have homes, who didn't have any resources available. And you can see down here that they raised questions, and then they came up with conjectures. Conjectures can be, we can get money together and we can send it to them. But then they began to think of other things that they could do to help the children who were involved with Hurricane Katrina. And how can we be good friends? And what they decided is one thing to do is they could make books, because the children didn't have books there, and that was one way of helping. Help doesn't have to be money, and help doesn't have to be food. They also wrote letters just giving support, moral support, and some of them even invited them to come to live with them and come to school. But you can begin to get this process going. So children themselves begin to see a situation. They see a problem. They ask questions. They come up with conjectures. They confirm or revise them, and then they present the information. And in this case, part of the presentation were letters that they got back from school children who were in New Orleans, thanking them for what they had sent in terms of books and support, moral support, and how it impacted their lives. This is very different than what we usually do in terms of dealing with a problem. But these kindergarten children took control of what they wanted to do and came up with some wonderful ideas related to social studies that they could confirm and share with others. This was second grade, and it was a unit on camouflage. And one of the students decided that he wanted to do a model of chameleons to show how chameleons could change color. They don't have, interestingly, different little color parts in it, but they have layers. And how they are, what the impact is, what they are against in terms of the background impacts the layers. And these layers will meld together or change in order to camouflage the chameleon. So this was a very different approach than you saw in the kindergarten one. This was third grade, and they decided to summarize what they had learned. They presented their conjecture about city wildlife and pollution and the impact of pollution on air, water, and how pesticides impacted all of this, and where it came from, how it endangered city life, how it endangered plants, and they just came up with summary statements that they shared and then went back and actually revised their conjecture. Totally different format. And then this was 5th grade, and I love this. This was on a unit in ecology, and they did a whole presentation on ecology about a conjecture and how we really are not capitalizing on good ecological activities in our community. And they talked about all of this and presented the information to the class, and then they ended it with a game that they created, what they call plastics by number. And everyone had bags full of different recycled plastic materials, and they had to identify each group, whether it could be recycled, what number it was, and what the impact was of recycling those particular items, all based upon what had been shared by the students from their ecology work. And then students need to ask new questions. They should be encouraged to use the knowledge to ask more questions. For example, what happens when money is redistributed? How does the government make this happen? Does it have to be the government alone? What alternatives can the government do to get the money circulating to help the poor? Most countries have some form of money, but why does barter still exist in many countries? Why does the amount of money we have in our country change? And it does change. Sometimes the government reins it in. Other times there's more in circulation. And how is this determined? These are all questions, new questions that arose from the student research. Now, we need to keep in mind what this inquiry is like. It's not lockstep. You don't just read, come up with questions, ask, formulate conjectures, do research, present it, and that's it. It should lead to the updating of conjectures and questions. Research leads to more questions. It is recursive. And inquiry is going to shift the criteria for success from finding the correct answer to constructing new questions and new conjectures. Again, as I said earlier, this lays the foundation for real research. And what is your role? You're going to be modeling. You need to model the process. You need to model asking questions. You need to model formulating conjectures, helping students identify a variety of resources. You need to scaffold learning. Some children will take this and fly. Others, you're going to have to help them ask better questions, to help them focus their ideas, to formulate conjecture. You're going to have to scaffold what kind of information to use, because most students won't think about creating an interview or a survey. You need to provide the time. This isn't going, if we say to students, learning takes time and effort, then we need to provide the time so they can put in the effort. And we need to value inquiry. And for people who know me, this is one of my all-time favorites. Never, ever think outside the box. We need to start thinking outside the box if we are, in fact, going to be igniting learning, not just through inquiry, but igniting learning, period. Inquiry is a never-ending process of asking questions, refining conjectures, collecting data and information, and expanding learning. It is going to take us and our students to new heights of learning, new heights of investigation, new heights of knowledge building if we give our students the time and the resources to do it. And a final thought, why inquiry? Because a mind that is stretched to a new idea never returns to its original dimension. This is where we want our students to go into the world of work and into their own personal worlds, broadening their ideas, changing their ideas, creating new ideas that will really have a major impact on them and the world in which we live. Thank you very much, and if there are questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Great. Thank you so much, Marcia. Like Marcia said, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box. So we've got a couple coming in here. So Marcia, and you may have addressed this in your presentation, but I'll go ahead and ask it. I have my fourth graders do project at the end of each unit where we go through these same basic steps. Is that the same thing as inquiry?
Well, the minute you say a project, it sort of raises, a thought in my mind, because a project really is something that tends to be more controlled by the teacher. Inquiry is controlled by the students. And it may be a project, but it may be any number. It may take on a very different forms as well. I would suggest to the person who asked that question to go back and take a look at what we were talking about. Take a look at the conventional, which tends to be projects in many cases, but then go on to the other. Are the students developing their own questions? Are they beginning to formulate conjectures? Are they using a wide range of resources in order to support or refute that conjecture? And then in the end, are they changing? How is that conjecture changing based upon new information? And how are they sharing it with the class? Because it is about sharing knowledge that helps also build new knowledge.
Great, thank you. Another question here. As I have my students go through the inquiry process, do some steps take longer than others, or should I spend the same amount of time on each step?
Oh, that's a great question. And that is going to vary. Remember, we talked about groups being formulated or being developed around a common question. And some groups may take it and fly. Others may need more support. In the beginning, so let's think about this. You may want to spend the same amount of time with all the groups working on the different aspects of the inquiry process. So you're really teaching them about it. As students begin to internalize that process, they can go ahead and move more independently. You may need to work as a teacher with some groups doing more scaffolding. They may not get as much done as the other groups, but just the process itself of going through and thinking about what you want to do and how you want to do it, even if you don't collect all the information, is a worthwhile activity for the group. Others may go through, formulate it themselves, and they may be able to do a presentation with a lot less support. Don't make this lockstep in terms of the process, and don't make it lockstep in terms of the group itself. We talked about inquiry being flexible. We need to be flexible. And that means we're going to expect different things from different groups. And you're going to see it by the end of the year. Students will begin to fly all on their own.
Thank you, Marcia. We have a couple questions coming in. We have a question from Karen. She says, I teach reading at the kindergarten level and work mostly on foundational skills. How would I be able to incorporate inquiry? Some of the examples you discussed focused on math and social studies.
Well, I mean, inquiry can be anything. As a kindergarten teacher, I'm sure that there are science and social studies units that you are working on all the time. And just, start small and take one science unit. It might be on change. It could be on shadows. It could be on any number of different things. Look at your science units in kindergarten and try doing inquiry as a whole class with that area of science, with an area of science. Build it into your curriculum. Don't make it a separate part of your curriculum. That kindergarten example was a unit on friendship, and it was a social studies. It was called social studies by the school district. And they just built that naturally in to their social studies units. So this absolutely can support the content you already are focusing on. You don't have to find new things.
Great. And then we have a question from Wendy. She asks, can a collaborative discussion be part of inquiry?
Absolutely. I mean, I only have X amount of time to talk, but there's no question. Discussion is part of inquiry. Collaborative discussion is part of inquiry from the very get-go. As students begin to read and ask questions, there should be collaborative discussion. As students form groups and they develop conjectures, that should be this collaborative discussion. It is collaborative discussion because the group is taking questions that share a common interest and formulating a conjecture. Throughout the process, the groups should be working with each other, and I want to underscore this, with each other, but also with the rest of the class. If one group is having a problem, how nice it would be, instead of the teacher saying, maybe you should do this, this, or this, to say, let's raise this issue with the whole class, and let's see what ideas they might come up with to help solve your problem. So now collaborative discussion isn't just within the groups, but across the groups as well. So collaborative discussion is an integral part of every aspect of inquiry.
Okay, it looks like we have time for one more question here. Question, I teach first grade and I don't believe my students are ready to handle learning that is self-directed. However, I would like for them to be exposed to the inquiry process. How can I handle this in my classroom, or is first grade too early?
Well, I don't think it's ever too early, because just think of all your first graders and the wonderful questions they come up with. And I totally, totally understand and respect where you're coming from. So let's make this a whole class activity. What an ideal way to teach even good questioning. So children will begin to ask questions, and you can help them reformulate them. Can we make that a good why question? Can we make it a good how question? And take their questions and help them reformulate them into good inquiry questions. All right, now the next step is, we've come up with a really good question. What do you think the answer to that question is? And let me tell you, the hands will go flying. So now you're beginning to develop your conjecture. And young children can do it. And you know what? I'm going to tell you right now, young children love big words. And conjecture is one of those words that they love. So you can use these words. It's good academic language. Don't ever hesitate. All right, now this is what we think the answer is. This is what our conjecture is. Now what you can do is have children break into groups, and each group becomes responsible for finding some information related to the conjecture. Then you can bring them back together again after each group has done some work, and you can work with them on that in small group time. And then you begin to bring all that information together. You can put up on a kindergarten wall, or first grade wall, all the information that the children have come up with, and then talk about how we can sort and categorize. This is a skill that we teach in kindergarten. And then based upon sorting and categorizing, let's put it together. What have we learned? Is it the same as what we thought at the beginning? Or do we want to change our conjecture because we have new information? And then put that information together and have them share it with another first grade classroom. Do it as a whole class activity. You can develop those habits of mind. You can develop inquiry with the whole group engaged in the whole process with your support. And then over time, believe me, they're going to start taking more and more responsibility for different aspects of the inquiry process. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you, Marcia. So I want to thank you, everyone, for attending our webinar today. We will be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the recording, so you guys can view that on demand. If we did not get to your question today, we will follow up with you individually. So again, thank you, Marcia, for presenting, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you all out there and wherever you are.